Hayao Miyazaki said that he made Ponyo for 5-year-old children, but there are a surprising number of details left in the film that only adults are likely to pick up on. Here are 5 things about Ponyo that only adults will notice. Sosuke is definitely not an adult, but he is a caregiver for Ponyo in the film. However, if the story happened in real life, his role as caregiver would probably be pretty short. When he rescues Ponyo after she gets stuck in a bottle, he puts her in a bucket and fills it up with water from the hose. But shouldn't that bucket be full of seawater? If you put an ocean fish in a freshwater bucket, that fish isn't going to last too long. Good thing that doesn't seem to matter to Ponyo, or this would be a really short movie.
A goldfish. Ponyo! Ponyo, Ponyo, Ponyo.
Can somebody tell me what is up with Ghibli parents driving like maniacs? The dad in Spirited Away does this too. I mean, I get it, it's funny, and looks like it was really fun to animate. But sometimes it seems like the most dangerous thing that Sosuke encounters on the island is his own mom. But even if you say, okay, her driving is exaggerated for fun, it's no big deal. There's a part where she's driving in torrential rain, and she comes to a flooded road with her kid in the car, but she decides to just plow right through it. That's a tough one to overlook, because as someone who used to live in an area where the monsoons would come every year, one of the first things you learn is that you don't run a car through running water. It's almost always going to be deeper and more powerful than it looks, and that's a good way to get washed away in a flood. Now, did I ever make the dumb decision and drive through those flooded roads anyway? Yeah, all the time, but not with a kid in the car. Another example of human adults acting very strangely in the movie is when it's time for Sosuke to go home after school, but there's a storm outside. His teacher at first says, "I'll call your mom to come pick you up," you know, like a sane person. And then Sosuke says, "That's okay, I'll just take the shortcut." And the adult woman in charge of this child's welfare is like, "All right then, why don't you walk home alone and unsupervised during this raging typhoon? Be on your way then, 5-year-old boy." It's gotta be one of my favorite parts of the movie now. She just bows to him because you want to be polite when you're sending a child into the middle of a furious death storm, and then he strolls through the door like he's gonna go pick up eggs at the supermarket for his mom. It's the most dignified, crazy moment I've ever seen. The music of any Ghibli film is a crucial part of what makes them special, and that's true with Ponyo from the very beginning scenes. The moon is out, so it's nighttime, but it's not completely quiet because there are a surprising amount of boats floating on the water, even if we don't see or hear any humans yet, other than the boat horns. The next shot drops us below the surface of the water, and things instantly start to get a bit more lively. The camera tilts down to show us that this is where the real action is, as those first few jellyfish are part of a huge group. And even that huge group is part of a larger chain of this massive horde of jellyfish that circle down to where Fujimoto is busy making fishes with a turkey baster. And no, that's not some horribly graphic slang expression, that's what he's actually doing. I love that the music swells with wonder as each part of that gigantic jellyfish tornado is revealed. Joe Hisaishi always does great work with Ghibli soundtracks, but this film is one of his best instances of making the music work with what occurs on the screen. There's that great first use of Ponyo's theme when we see her character for the first time, for example. One thing that's interesting about Ponyo's soundtrack is the way it will form these musical motifs that gesture at other pieces of music without fully copying them. I'm pretty sure there are at least 2 spots in Ponyo where Joe Hisaishi is referencing a specific piece of music without straight up playing the original tune. One I'm almost positive of, and the other might be more of a stretch, but I'll let you decide. When Ponyo and her sisters are transformed by the power of their father's magic well, the soundtrack becomes very reminiscent of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Which is a good fit for this rushing, magical swarm of fish and the newfound, unstoppable power that Ponyo exhibits as she makes her way towards Sosuke. It's also a piece of music about a group of magical sisters who are unleashing their powers, just like Ponyo and her sisters. One thing I find interesting is that, to my ear, the soundtrack becomes more and more like Ride of the Valkyries the closer Ponyo gets to Sosuke, though that might just be my imagination. Another thing that could just be my imagination is that I swear I hear the notes of Heartful of Love from Les Miserables from time to time as well. You can call me crazy if you want, but these snippets of melody that sound like Heart Full of Love are playing during scenes between Sosuke and Ponyo. And in Les Mis, the occasion of this song is when a boy and a girl meet each other for the first time and realize that they love each other. It's a pretty good fit if Hisaishi meant to put it in there, though again, it just might be a coincidence. You make the call. There are lots of paleontology references throughout this movie, such as Fujimoto's submarine being named Pangaea, after the ancient supercontinent. Many of the background references in Ponyo are a love letter to the Devonian period in Earth's history, roughly 420 to 360 million years ago, which is even older than Pangaea. The Devonian is directly mentioned when Fujimoto says that when his magic well fills up with magic potion, then the Earth will be returned to the way it was during the Devonian age. He's got a few extinct species from the Devonian swimming around his underwater lair, and more show up when Ponyo and her sisters release the magic of the well. Almost all of these creatures are real species from Earth's distant past, except for Devonicus, which appears to be a fictional fish who I think was meant as an homage to the Devonian period, given its name. The Devonian is an interesting point in time for Fujimoto to want to return to. Paleontologists often call it the Age of Fishes, because of the incredible amount of fish diversity in the sea. The Devonian period was also the point in history where the first vertebrate animals were able to take their first steps from the ocean onto the land. Since Fujimoto dislikes humans and their polluting ways, the Devonian is a good pick if you're more concerned with fish, which is why he's trying to turn the world back to that time. Many of the Devonian fish who show up after the magic is released are placoderms, one of my favorite groups of extinct fish. These guys basically had bony plate armor covering their heads and sometimes the first set of their fins, while the rest of their bodies were usually soft and unprotected. Unfortunately, they all died out millions of years ago. There's nothing like any of these placoderms swimming around today's oceans. There could be an explanation for why Ponyo and her sisters were able to release the magic and start the Earth back towards the Devonian, while Fujimoto could not. Think about that scene where he's trying to force Ponyo back into her fish form and stop her from changing. Of course, it's meant to show an example of a father trying to foolishly stop his little girl from growing up, but the important point here is how hard it is for him to do it. He remarks that she's already grown so powerful, like her mother, Grandma Mare, and he needs to use some performance-enhancing magic to bulk up and overpower Ponyo, just like a mid-90s baseball player trying to hit a home run. If Fujimoto's base magic level is relatively weak, but he could still bring about the Devonian catastrophe if he had a well full of magic, then it shouldn't be a surprise if the combined power of Ponyo and all of her little sisters is enough to kickstart that Devonian shift when they release the magic of the well, even if it's not nearly full of magic potion yet. The choice of the Devonian period also explains why the moon is coming so close to the Earth. The moon has been circling slowly farther and farther away from Earth since its formation, and in the Devonian age it was about half the distance from Earth that it is now. This means that full moons would have looked absolutely huge, and also that the moon's gravitational effect on the tides would have been much stronger. The highs would be much higher, and the lows would have been much lower. The whole reason why the moon is moving closer to the Earth at all in the movie, at least according to my interpretation, is because that's where it was during the Devonian, and Fujimoto's magic is trying to return it there. It's not because he was trying to crash the moon into the Earth and destroy all humankind like some Ghibli version of Majora's Mask. Kids are going to focus on the main protagonists of the film, Sosuke and Ponyo, but I think the character that is most interesting for adults is Fujimoto. Yes, he's the antagonist of the film, and he's kind of an archetype for all overbearing fathers. But I think the more interesting question is, who is this guy? He's a magical sea wizard who can apparently create fish at will. He can communicate with the sea creatures and even with the waves themselves. He lives in a cool submarine house at the bottom of the sea, and he brings his ocean water pump with him because he needs it so that he doesn't dry out, even though he seems to spray the water on everything else except for himself. There's one scene where we're shown the inside of Fujimoto's ship house that possibly tells us more about him than the entire rest of the movie. Fujimoto needs more power to control Ponyo, so he enters this room full of pottery vessels that contain what appear to be different vintages of magic potion. We get that great bit of information that Fujimoto used to be a human, but he gave up his humanity in order to serve Earth and maintain the balance of nature. He also seems to have married the goddess of the sea, so nice work, Fujimoto. He's also terrified of her. But my favorite detail in this room is that those vessels of magic potion are all numbered with what appears to be a year, and this gives us a clue as to how old Fujimoto might be. There are a few jars that are labeled with dates from the 20th century, such as 1951, but there's one that goes back to 1871 as well. If this is the year that Fujimoto made this vintage, then he would have been a grown man at least 137 years ago. And that's if we assume that the 1871 jar is the oldest one. 1871, by the way, is the year that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was published in book form. Fujimoto and his submarine might remind you of that book, and that's not an accident. There's a brief look at a jar off in the corner that has the number 195 in it, but I'm pretty sure that that's a typo, instead of the other explanation, which is that Fujimoto is almost 2,000 years old. Although one bit of circumstantial evidence in support of Fujimoto's ancient age is that the potions are stored in jars that look like Roman amphora, which is a style of two-handed pottery vessel that was common from the ancient Greek ages through the end of the Roman Empire. If Fujimoto was alive back then, and if he'd perhaps traveled around the world in his efforts to serve nature, then he might have copied that style for his own use and continued to use it up to the film's present day. I would also love to know the story behind Fujimoto's clothing, because in my culture, he looks like he's one hat away from bursting into song and joining a barbershop quartet. But I doubt that's the same vibe in Japanese culture. Maybe he was just intended to look strange or mysterious. My favorite possibility about Fujimoto is that he was very much like Sosuke hundreds or even thousands of years ago. He decided to love a magical creature of the sea, and in so doing, he brought back balance to nature, but he had to give up his humanity in the process. There's no telling if Sosuke will lose his humanity in the future, but he does give up some of the control over the path of his own life when he takes on the responsibility for Ponyo. And as long as we're talking about a new generation of characters taking over magical roles from the previous generation, I sometimes like to imagine that Lisa is destined to become the new Gran Mamare, and that when they talked together for an entire night, Gran Mamare was preparing her to take those first steps towards becoming the caretaker of life in the sea. Although I tend to think that their conversation was more about what was going on, what was going to happen to everybody, and maybe a few tips on how to raise a magical fish girl. One of the main themes of Ponyo is it tries to blur the lines between life on land and life in the sea. Land and ocean are often shown as two completely separate kingdoms in other movies. Once you cross that boundary line into the sea, you're in a foreign, alien, and dangerous world. But the ocean in Ponyo is not rigidly boxed off from the rest of the world. It's almost as if instead of a harsh dividing line, the surface of the water is merely a place where the air gets a little thicker in terms of how the life below it behaves. There's a lot of mixture between the above and below worlds, and creatures and weather phenomena cross that boundary all the time. The sea reaches over its bounds at times and crawls onto land, and the effects of the land crossing into the sea show up in the form of human pollution. I really like how the title sequence changes to a different art style that even further cements this idea of life above and below water being equal parts of a whole, with very little in the way of boundaries between them. The coloring and the use of lines really shows that these are equal and interconnected parts of the same world. The sea looks like just a slightly darker version of the sky here. There's also a fun, almost cubist perspective that the sequence uses too. Everything is shown in profile, no matter where it's placed vertically within the image. So you can see an island seemingly floating in the ocean, but the whale then looks like it's floating in the sky. Of course, it could be that the sky is never shown in that shot at all, and the whole sequence is composed of shots of the sea from a top-down point of view. Sometimes there will be an illustration of waves rushing towards the land, and then that trick of perspective will come into play, and they'll just slosh by harmlessly. But there is one spot where it seems like there are two submerged buildings that are sinking into the ocean as the sea levels rise. Somehow, this still seems like a friendly depiction, especially given the soundtrack and the context of the other happy images in that sequence. The song being sung at that time, brilliantly, by Masako Hayashi, is Mother Sea, and it feels more like that scene is showing us a mother's loving embrace rather than a killer tsunami that's trying to wipe away any trace of humans. It's a beautiful way to open the movie, and it shows us right away that music is going to play a key role in the film, and that all forms of life owe a debt to their Mother Sea. There's one more bonus tip that I want to end with, and that's an explanation of the line that the sailor says as Gran Mamare goes by. He sees the wondrous form of the Lady of the Sea as she passes underneath, and exclaims, "I just saw the Lady of Mercy." Now, anyone who's already watched the bonus features on the Blu-ray is probably already aware of this, but before Miyazaki started work on Ponyo, he retreated to a quaint fishing village that he had stayed at for a company meeting. He found a home that would take in visitors, and he rented out the whole building and sent all the staff home. For multiple weeks, he lived a simple life there, doing his own laundry and cooking his own meals whenever he stayed in, and doing all of the cleaning himself. Each morning, he would challenge himself by taking a walk to a Shinto shrine that was located at the top of a steep hill. He would climb these steps and arrive at a cliffside area that overlooked the sea. Miyazaki would spend hours at a time looking at the sea as a new story started to take root in his mind. That story would eventually become Ponyo. There at the top of the hill was a lonely statue that Miyazaki took a liking to. That statue was called the Lady of Mercy, and the influence of this gentle divinity was transformed into the motherly healing power of Grandma Mare. I hope you enjoyed this look at 5 things only adults will notice about Ponyo. I know I enjoyed revisiting this underrated film. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.